Welcome back to this conversation from my front porch. I hope that you are sitting on a stoop or a step or your own porch, perhaps a comfortable bench, as we explore together this question around building resilience from a consciousness perspective and how increased resilience can support us to reduce our intolerance of uncertainty, noting that we are facing rapid change and a growing sense of uncertainty and ambiguity in a very volatile world. You have the capacity to build this resilience within you, especially using consciousness methods, primarily expanded states of consciousness, which is what we're going to talk about today. In essence, this is the solution to build a greater resilience and ability to withstand what is difficult and uncomfortable. I want to start by noting that in the last episode together, I spoke about the death of our son and the rapid change that unfolded after his death. And I want to start with noting that for a period of time, I dug deep into my toolbox and leaned into a number of we'll call it psychological tools that I knew might help me to rebuild my resilience, my ability to stay present and strong and centered in the midst of so much change and upheaval. And I'm here to confess that they took me to a certain level, and yet it wasn't really digging deep enough for me. It wasn't getting to the root or the core of some of these. It's a real existential fear or even an existential anxiety that I was experiencing. In other words, it managed many of the symptoms I was experiencing, but I wanted something more. I wanted to access a resilience in me that I knew would carry me through not just the turmoil I was facing, but even build a skill set, really a state of being within me that I knew would sustain me in whatever came my way. And you may be facing adversity right now, some significant challenges in your life, and that may echo within you that you want something that goes beneath the surface of simply managing, whether it's anxiety or fear or discomfort, or even feeling an avoidance of anything that is challenging. And this is where expanded states of consciousness truly are the solution. I want to start with chatting with you, really sharing with you from my heart about what it means to work at 3 levels that are necessary to access a conscious resilience within. And what I mean by a conscious resilience is that non-changing, never-ending, permanent state of being that absolutely is with you no matter what. What we often do is we start to work at a personal level. And in particular, when we work at a personal level around uncertainty and fear, then we, skim the surface. What we're accessing, in essence, is our innate fear of death and our desire for self-preservation. Now, as you hear these words, there may be an awareness within you that even a scoffing, that you're not afraid of death, or you're not afraid of preserving yourself, that you feel like perhaps you don't even matter that much. And I want to push us all very kindly to say that all of us are hardwired for self-preservation, to actually fear our own death, because it is the greatest uncertainty that we face. And for any of you that have lost a loved one or kind of had a brush or a close encounter with death, you know that very deep and palpable fear in the inside that absolutely grips you. And that's the depth that we're talking about right here. So when we are working with, building resilience from a consciousness perspective, it requires us to access that deep fear on the inside that we will die, and that we do not know when we are going to die. And as I say those words, I know that they're uncomfortable perhaps to hear. And I want to hearken back to what we talked about, just a few days ago, that we have a heightened, almost I would call it an oversensitivity right now, to avoid any sort of triggers. And it doesn't mean that we want to just directly try to trigger one another by kind of that affrontive sort of truth-telling that gets in your face and wants to try to create a reaction. That's not what I'm talking about. But instead, when we encounter the truth that we will die someday and that our life is not permanent, we can start to get to those deeper levels of building resilience. And this is where there's an acceptance and even an acknowledgement of our potential at any point in time to die, and that there is a possibility to start to transmute that preference for self-preservation. And I'll talk about how we actually do that in a moment. And then I want to talk about the second level with you, which is an interpersonal fear that at its root is also driving some of our uncertainty right now. And that is the fear, even the terror of being alone. And right now you may notice that you have a preference perhaps to be alone sometimes, and there's a healthy amount of isolation and being alone, of course, for self-care and to tend to what you need. And in our world right now, there is increasing levels of isolation. Many of them are chosen and some of them are not. And we know that there's a fracturing happening in terms of our sense of community and connection with one another, that in this isolation, there is an increased levels of loneliness that are actually hitting an endemic level. But we know that deep, again, we're going to a consciousness level, deep within, we all have this absolute terror of being alone in the world. And that sense of aloneness is also where resilience will come along on its heels. When we acknowledge and allow ourselves to feel that we are truly afraid and uncertain about being alone, then we can start to heal at those deeper levels. So again, that's that interpersonal connection where it is about you and another person, you and a system, you and groups of people, you and community, that when we acknowledge and even value in some way that we are in a place of interconnection with one another, this is where we can start to transmute that driver of fear within us. And then finally, the third level is looking at collective fear. So that fear of harm, of what we would harm someone else or someone else might harm us. And it's my personal opinion that this is perhaps one of the drivers that is creating the great divisions right now that we're experiencing in our world and especially in our country. We are very deeply influenced by these anxieties, fear of war, economic collapse, climate disaster, or even how our communities perceive us. And when we get to those roots, we can again start to transmute them at its core and discover that there is a resilience that starts to come forward as we are present with that collective fear. That fear of how we may be harmed by others and how we conversely may harm them. So I hope you're following with me and connecting in this moment. You may even feel those layers within that we have this personal fear of self-survival, and it can breed a sense of uncertainty in our world. Those questions about who am I, the tight hold we may have on identity and our personal value that wants to start to shift so that we're no longer driven by that uncertainty of how do I stand in this world. And then that second layer of interpersonal uncertainty really presenting as fear, that deep driver of knowing that we are terrified to be alone. And again, this is not about preferences for whether you're introverted or extroverted. That's not what we're talking about. We're really engaging at a deep existential layer where you're considering that sense of aloneness within, of what it means to truly be alone at any moment. And it can evoke a very visceral fear. And with that, we avoid anything that might be uncertain, where we may feel that aloneness that is sort of creeping up and bringing forward those deeper fears. And then finally, a collective fear, that fear of harm to self and others, manifesting as an uncertainty, even of how am I in relationship with this broader world? How am I connecting with it? Where is the points of vulnerability and pain, of feeling exposed, and in which there is a desire for protecting not just yourself, but also your tribe. And we see that right now in terms of how we are aligning with one another. And all of that comes from these, again, very deep, what we might call an ultimate concern, these primary motivations within us that are essential to access from a consciousness level so that we can transmute them in a way that then evokes a resilience. And this is where we'll go next together.